something more strategically focused, meaning, first of all, people who think strategically, but second, also portions of the bureaucracy themselves preoccupied with comprehensive national strategic planning in an era of change. We don't do that. We don't do that in the White House systematically. It's only partially being done in the State Department. The Defense Department naturally focuses on warfare as the ultimate option, and the intelligence community on learning more about those who may wish us ill. That is not a good system. And I think the president's responsibilities are so demanding that he has to have really close to him people deliberately chosen with these qualities in mind and with the mechanisms assisting them in the center of the government. And that means that the Secretary of State has to be his chosen agent for seeking strategic solutions with a peaceful outcome and with full support, but not be responsible for the overall strategy, because the overall strategy has to have all the other elements in it as well. And that is, of course, an unpalatable conclusion for the people in the responsibility of heading different departments, but I think it is unavoidable. And I think those presidents who themselves provided some of that, or who had some people next to them who thought in that fashion, tended to be more effective as presidential leaders in the area of foreign policy in recent years than those who haven't.
Thank you. David Rothkopf? Well, it's a pattern here, so I'll start with the first time that I met Zbig. I was 22 years old, and I was an aide to a congressman named Steve Solars, who's passed, who was a wonderful guy, deeply interested in foreign policy. I had just joined his staff, and he, in an act of great charity, he thought, invited me to join him for a meeting with the National Security Advisor in the White House. I'd never been to the White House. I'd never met a National Security Advisor, and it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Because Zbig, as you can see here, he's brilliant, but he's also a little twinkly right now. You know, he's a kind of charming and elfin. And you know, when I met him in the White House, he was just as intimidating a human being as you could possibly be. And I felt ill at ease for the whole meeting. Now, having said that, I also, then they were talking about an issue, and I think the issue had to do with North Korean gunboats, of some kind of issue around that. And he peeled away strategic layer after strategic layer, and it began with the incident, and then with the North Koreans, and then with the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and then with the Chinese, and then with the Russians, and then with our interests. And it was clear that behind this, there was a worldview. And I found this very intimidating, and I've ended up spending a lot of my life, probably because of the scars from that meeting, studying the National Security Council. And you know, I agree with your assertion here that you need to have this strategic capacity within the White House. And the best of the people who've occupied the National Security Advisor chair have tried to do it. And I've talked to Brent about efforts to do it and how they, you know, inevitably are overtaken by events. Sandy Berger talks about, you know, this phenomenon in Washington where the urgent always overtakes the important. And all sorts of solutions come up. Typically, they involve adding staff at the National Security Council. So I think when Henry was running the NSC and it reached its biggest, it was 40 people or something like that. And today we're nearing 400 people on the national security staff. But it doesn't seem any more strategic to me. You know, I don't think just making it bigger is creating the synthesis. And you know, for a while, perhaps during the Cold War, there was a kind of a model. There was a bipolar world. There was, as was indicated in the earlier panel, there was a strategy at the center of it. But it seems to me over the course of the past couple of years, we've really been floundering, looking for a model. And one thing that strikes me is that over the arc of your career, at the very beginning, there was a lot of talk about balance of power. Henry Kissinger wrote his doctoral dissertation about balance of power world. This was in the early 50s. We had just come out of a balance of power war. And then we went into bipolarity, and then we went into what we thought was unipolarity, and then when, after 9/11, we decided to equate the enemy that emerged then with our Cold War enemies so that we would be in a kind of new pseudo-bipolarity. And now, at the end of this cycle, we seem to be coming back to balance of power. But that actually requires understanding all the players, whether they're the regional actors, the regional influentials, or whatever the term that Madeline used. And that requires a kind of synthetic mind. And you know, we talk about the structures that require strategy. You also need people to deal with strategy. And you've got a room full of young people who are here studying this. And one of the things that struck me in sort of writing about the NSC is that people like Brent or Steve or any of the people on the panel or Henry or you wake up for morning and, you know, you sort of want to know what great people like this have for breakfast. And it's my impression that what they have for breakfast is the world. You know, they sort of wake up and say, what's going on? How do these pieces fit together? How does this affect my worldview? But there seem to be fewer and fewer people out there who are looking strategically. And you've got a group of young people, and you're in an institution that's trying to train people to do that. And I'm wondering what kind of advice you might give to sort of guide people in the direction of not looking at the headline or not looking at the regional issue or today's issue, but connecting the dots.
Well, first of all, I do want to say that there's no shortage of brain power in this country, and there's no shortage in the final analysis of individuals with the capacity to do what is needed. And I think we've already had an example of that by the panelists that have appeared before on the stage and are appearing on the stage right now. The question is whether power centrally can be organized in such a way that the strategic definition of the challenges that we face can be pursued in a systematic fashion with some degree of prioritization. And there is a president who understands that he has a narrow window of opportunity for the fulfillment of the specified objectives, and who is able to mobilize public opinion on behalf of it. And this is the additional dimension which I want to stress for a second. In most of the conflicts in which the United States has been engaged in since it became a major international power, it was easy to confide to the public a simple truth. We are threatened, they're threatening us. Our cause is good, they are bad. We are a democracy, they're not a democracy, or they don't know how to create a democracy, or in some cases, they don't deserve democracy, but prolonged tutelage from us. Today, it is so much more complicated. And the pressure of events is so intense. And our public, given this context of everything moving in on us and information being so available, is staggeringly uninformed. And therefore, formulating a policy that the public can support and understand goes beyond the capacity of a single individual, no matter how rhetorically skillful he is as president. We really need to think very seriously about the issue of what really informs our public in those continuously complex conditions in which the leadership faces threats to our national security day in and day out. It's rare that there's going to be an overriding and simple threat. China is not going to attack us somehow or other. Now, conceivably, at some point in the next 20 years, if China were to develop unprecedented capacities in cyber warfare and so forth, conceivably, we could be all of a sudden defeated in one day without knowing that we're defeated. But that is still a remote future. Much more likely are ambiguous conflicts which the public doesn't understand and the basis for which has not been laid through systematic education, training, and information. We don't have more than 4 or at most 5 major newspapers in this country that give international news on a reliable basis. on a daily basis. We have minimum of really serious world news on the networks. The so-called evening news, half an hour about the world, is maybe for 45 seconds, some world news if something really important happens, some calamity. Most of it is human interest stories, increasingly medical information, because that's become a national obsession. Probably something sensational involving some major figure in entertainment business and so forth. Who really provides systematic information about the world to the American public that otherwise watches television the way people used to pray in the past?
And the conclusion you're coming to is Foreign Policy magazine?
That was, of course, going to be my punchline at the end. You've taken it away. But the point is, all right, on television, it's the news hour. And now, increasingly available to us, foreign networks. BBC, not bad at all. Not bad, France 24. And increasingly good and increasingly accessible, Al Jazeera, which does actually a surprisingly good job of conveying repeatedly 30 minutes of world news. But that doesn't originate from within the United States. It doesn't have really large support. So we have a public that's easily susceptible to large-scale demagogy and overreacting to problems or misunderstanding them or ignoring them until they become overwhelming. After 9/11, of course, terrorism became the enemy number one. And here there was a curious interaction between the public's ignorance and therefore susceptibility to demagogy and our official reaction. We immediately declared war on jihadist terror without considering what the combination of words means to those people to whom jihad means holy war, the equivalent of crusades to Christians. We helped to create in the public an atmosphere of fear that has had a variety of complicating problems for our position in the world, our ability to operate intelligently in the Middle East, or even our own sense of national security. I mean, we live here in Washington, and I have said this a couple of times, it has shocked people to hear me say this, but I'm appalled by how all of these offices on K Street and everywhere else have these people sitting on the ground floor, dressed in some pseudo-uniform, on which it is written prominently on their shoulders, security, and they invite you to tell them who you want to see, on what floor, and then you're asked to sign a document, a paper indicating your name and show your ID. And I've gotten so tired of this that on a number of occasions, I simply wrote out Osama bin Laden. I've never once been stopped. But which shows how, the public can become so obsessed at different moments with dramatic challenges, which in some cases don't even warrant that judgment, that it becomes very difficult for us to spend money intelligently on national security, on intelligence, on military force, but also on gaining national influence with other key players who are not as powerful as we, but who cumulatively make it very difficult for us to exercise the kind of hegemony that we enjoyed roughly for 13 years after 1990. For 13 years after 1990, we were supreme in the world. We were the supreme sole global superpower. And everybody knew it and was resigned to it, may have hated it, but was prepared to respect it. We have receded dramatically. And recovering some of that territory, I think, will depend also on the ability of our society to generate a public that will then listen to intelligent leadership when it advises and reports to the country courses of accommodation or self-restraint or cooperation with others, even those with whom we don't have the same beliefs, the same principles, but are prepared to accept the reality of having to share responsibility for the world. Secretary Clinton was a superb secretary for global affairs, and she made some progress in that respect. But this has to be continued as a long-term commitment, and yet at the same time